Hello audience, and welcome to another video here on the channel where I, the disheveled goblin, will be speaking to the regular goblins of the audience about how Stephen King specifically writes horror and how effective he has been at appealing to a mass audience while not really holding any punches back. I mean, we know that for sure, right? He's written multiple scenes about and yet he's still sold over 350 million copies worldwide. Dear Lord. But what gives him that element of success? Is it a little bit of cumin and thyme? No. It's about the way Stephen King writes. And the reason I bring this up is because you will frequently see people online talking about how Stephen King is a bad writer, a sentiment I vehemently disagree with. I even tweeted about it recently, and hey, Stephen King himself retweeted it. And as someone who Stephen King retweets, I just, think I'm able to now speak on the matter because as someone who Stephen King retweets, it's just something that I think elevates me above the rest. But don't worry, as someone who Stephen King retweets, I don't think I'm getting much of an ego about it because as someone who Stephen King retweets, it's just, we're above that. So why exactly have so many great films been based off Stephen King's works? Why do so many authors quote him as a major influence? Well, I think partially that's because Stephen King has mastered the idea of beauty and simplicity and woven that theory into the way he pens horror. In this video, we're going to look at two Stephen King passages. One just as a general chunk to show how he uses rather simple words to convey a very visceral feeling of emotion. And the second, we're actually going to go through line by line to show how the structure of King's writing can help convey terror as well. I am trying to convince you, Stephen King is one of the best American writers we have in terms of accomplishing what he's setting out to do. That's a very important distinction. No, I'm not going to try and make the case that he's some brilliant wordsmith on the level of Patrick Rothfuss or Guy Gavriel Kay, because he's not trying to be. There's this frequent criticism of King where people are like, oh, he's blue-collar writing. Well, one, that's fine to be that if it's your intent to do so. And two, fancy writing would detract from what King does. If he tried to inject a bunch of $4 words into a passage about a child experiencing fear from a clown, it would break immersion. These critics who call King simplistic are right, but the ones who are claiming what he is doing is somehow inherently wrong are wrong. Though, quick disclaimer, I'm not someone who really thinks you can write wrong. I'm someone who doesn't even really believe in objective review. We're all a bunch of caffeinated space apes flying through space. Nothing actually means anything. If you want to artistically go a certain angle, no one can tell you you're wrong to do so. So, hey, if you disagree with that philosophy, that's okay, but that's my personal approach. I am more than willing as a critic to go ahead and dive into the faults of a certain attempt, but I'm never going to actually bash the intent itself. But getting back on topic, if you are an experienced Stephen King reader, you will already know there's quite the diversity in his actual prose style. Stephen King is willing to borderline sound poetic at times, and he will occasionally use some more fancy, non-blue-collar words, as these critics condescendingly put it. Other times, though, Stephen King is willing to completely turn off the poeticism and abuse the shit out of some adjectives. Is that, as I saw one person put it, trailer trash writing? Absolutely not, because it serves a purpose and accomplishes something the author is setting out to do. Now, I will give an olive branch to some of King's critics, of course, because not every writer is perfect, not everything's going to be flawless. There are certainly elements to King's writing that are weaker. Occasional descriptions aren't as concise and clear as they could be. You could also defend that as intentional, but yeah, even as a reader, I'm willing to acknowledge sometimes a descriptor King gives makes me go a little, huh? But let's look at the genre King in general is writing within. The horror genre for me has an interesting angle every writer who attempts to write in it must take into account, and that is how they're going to handle characters' reactions to a terrifying circumstance. Will they bring the internal turmoil into the writing itself and make it so that you as the reader are experiencing this elevated sense along with the character, or leave the reader slightly detached and not change the prose style that much? King has an interesting blend. When an intense scene is going down, of course, King uses a slightly different prose style than in his typical just elongated, you're exploring whatever setup is happening scene. Yet, through this more simplistic quote-unquote blue-collar writing style he's already using in general, it's a much more natural transition, and it feels extremely smooth to you as the reader. I also think this has the appeal of seeming more human. We are not poetic. We also fixate on weird shit. Just yesterday, I was taking my cat to the vet, and while he was there, I just noticed I for some reason was counting the collars on display. No idea why, I was just bored. It's what my mind decided to pick up and focus on. We don't exactly control what we notice, and this is another part of the human experience I think King actually brings into his prose, where he just picks out small details very specifically to just have a placement of something in the scene with the reader, and to me, that even, especially in scenes of horror, helps drag your mind into the experience of the character. So what I'm saying is his messiness and his simplicity can come together to feel human. I get more immersed in King's writing than any other author I read regularly. This isn't even taking into account his character work, which on its own does a lot of the lifting for the exact same process I'm trying to convey here. It's just that combining that with his general prose style, what you have is this magnificent blend where you believe the character, you relate to them, you understand them, and the way the story is told to you and you're dragged into the scene. To me, it doesn't even feel like Stephen King is pulling you into the world. Instead, he's putting the world around you. Combine that with his magical realism with his fantasy stories and his horror, and it just always feels like this is something that could be happening in the apartment next door, the house across the road. It's Earth, it's us, it's human. That's where his horror comes from. To simplify this idea as much as possible, let's pull from a horror cliche. You are standing in front of your vanity mirror, right? You do the thing where you bend down, you spit out toothpaste, you rinse your mouth, you stand back up, and you see the reflection of a dead relative behind you. Is your thought process in that moment going to be, what a perplexing apparition? Or is your mind going to melt and just descend into I would safely assume the latter. Let's look at a passage from Misery. Blood squirted from the lawn boy's gas exhaust in an amazing jet. The kid in the trooper uniform screamed. There was a sharp clang as the mower's whirling blade struck the pistol. Then Annie was swerving up the side lawn, using it to turn, and her gaze fell on Paul for 1 second, and Paul felt sure he knew what that momentary gaze meant. First the Smoky, then you. The kid was laying on his side again. When he saw the mower bearing down on him, he rolled over on his back and dug frantically at the driveway dirt with his heels, trying to push himself under the cruiser, where she couldn't get him. He didn't even come close. Annie throttled the riding mower up to a scream and drove it over his head. Paul caught a last glimpse of horrified brown eyes, saw tatters of a brown khaki uniform shirt hanging from an arm raised in a feeble effort at protection, and when the eyes were gone, Paul turned away. The lawn boy's engine suddenly lugged down, and there was a series of fast, strangely liquid, thudding sounds. Paul vomited beside the chair with his eyes closed. Not one of them $4 words, no overly flowery descriptions, just a almost dry statement of what's happening. And yet, it pulls you in as the reader. You know these things because you can relate to every word said, because there's something you would come across in your day-to-day life. If you were watching this scene, you wouldn't be thinking, indubitably. You'd be going, okay, I hear you. Yes, he writes the human experience well in a way that appeals to a lot of people, myself included, but it's more than just word choice, and I agree. That's why I'm going to pull from one of my favorite passages from The Shining. It's such a brief bit, and yet it paints such a vivid picture, and it's such a clear, concise sequence. It's honestly one of the scariest things I've ever read. His breath stopped in a gasp. An almost drowsy terror stole through his veins. Yes, there was something in here with him. Some awful thing the Overlook had saved for just such a chance as this. Maybe a huge spider that had burrowed down under the dead leaves, or a rat, or maybe the corpse of some little kid that had died here on the playground. Had that ever happened? At the far end of the concrete ring, Danny heard the stealthy crackling of dead leaves as something came for him on its hands and knees. That is one of the most terrifying things I've ever read. It's f***ing poetry of horror. Notice there's nothing overtly beautiful or complex. You could write that. The difference is you wouldn't, because the genius comes in the structure. He's forming this actual scene before you in this fantastic escalation. Like, it works so well, you don't need to know the rest of the story of The Shining to be afraid of what just happened in that little snippet. Let's break it down line by line. Now, King will often start a little sequence like this with a direct action to establish something has happened and perk your ears up as the reader to go, okay, what's about to unfurl? So we begin with his breath stopped in a gasp, which leads you to go, what's wrong? An almost drowsy terror stole through his veins. Now, some editors, I know for a fact, would hammer at this line. They would tell him to remove drowsy, it would be simplified, things like that. But I like Stephen King's insistence on using not entirely necessary words. It's almost like this meta fog King often puts into his text that I notice. I especially saw it a lot in Pet Sematary, where he has a lot of just little words, descriptors, that whether you can exactly understand what he's conveying or not, it's just enough detail that you can feel the wrongness. There's no other author in the world who will make you feel the wrongness of a scene more than King. I challenge you to think of somebody else, but let's go ahead and move on to the next line. Yes. Yes. Okay, simple repetition, right? It's a very simple practice you'll see a lot of the times in sequences of escalation, where someone is reaffirming, oh my God, this is true, it's really happening. A quick yes, yes. I like this because I've been in situations of immense terror, of disturbing things. Your mind kind of rejects at first and then accepts. To me, this communicates that feeling I've experienced very well. There was something in here with him. Some awful thing the Overlook had saved for just such a chance as this. Threat established and conveyed without specificity, which in horror is usually a good thing. That way your mind and imagination take over and begin pulling and exaggerating, and you can feel the fear set in. As is just well known, your mind is always going to be able to go in a vague sense in a more terrifying direction than any literal description generally can take you. Now, I want to clarify this is not always the proper practice. For example, if you want to switch over to another Stephen King work like It, where Pennywise is standing in broad daylight and in front of the children he is terrifying, he's quickly and often just painted away and you understand what exactly is there. But in a scene of this, where there's a rising tension, something that is clearly building in this gradual manner, then you generally want to keep it more, okay, let's hold back and then reveal, or never reveal, and just have the terror come from the unknowing. Maybe a huge spider that had burrowed down under the dead leaves, or a rat, or maybe the corpse of some little kid that had died here on the playground. Fantastic. Start with the least terrifying and escalate. Well, okay, some people are going to say rats are more terrifying, others spiders. I don't care. Start with real world horrors where people are bothered by these things, and then add a line through sensory that actually ties the reader into the moment yet again, the burrowing down through dead leaves. We've all heard that. We all know that sound. We all know the smell of dying leaves. We've all seen animals probably burrowing into these things. It's something that, again, ties you to it, but then Stephen King overlays a nightmare, or maybe the corpse of some little kid that had died here on the playground. Okay. Scary. I'm particularly partial to being afraid of dead children. Don't know why, it's just been a lifelong fear. And living children. Kids scare me. They genuinely do. But because we start with something believable, something you can picture, and then he ties you into that moment with a descriptor of an experience, the sound of dead leaves being burrowed in, you are then placed in that moment. Then he comes in and finishes it off with the actual, here's the fright, without confirming it. It's still just a speculation from the character. So your mind is still able to wander and go beyond the suggestion. Had that ever happened? Another completely possibly cuttable line, but to me reminds me that we are in the perspective of this character who's experiencing it, and some editor might pull this out, but I love it. At the far end of the concrete ring, Danny heard the stealthy crackle of dead leaves as something came for him on its hands and knees. Oh my God, the delivery, the finisher, the last, that's so spooky! Again, it's not confirmed to us that this is a dead child running at Danny on his hands and knees. But the implication from the descriptor does heavily imply that, confirming the worst of the nightmare scenarios propositioned before. We're also reminded of that sensory connection to place us, the reader, there. We are in this playground hearing these sounds alongside Danny, and I am just as afraid as this little kid is. My God, I want to run away from it and go to my daddy, except my daddy in this situation is Jack Torrance, so never mind. It's just a very effective example of making it so that it's not just the character who's under attack, we are under attack. We are the target of this threat. We are in this moment. powerful. And this ties into everything I've been saying about Stephen King's prose up until this. It's effective and smart in its simplicity. He uses these simple tools to build something that is just rock solid. No flowery words, no complicated descriptions, just an exploitation of our own sensory input and our own experiences as readers to put us in a scene where a nightmare is introduced. Some would criticize it as simple. I would add on to that it's also effective, and that accomplishes exactly what is being set out for. And it ties together with Stephen King's entire vision. He is a magical realism horror author. It's not about putting you in a fantasy world. It's about bringing his terrors into your actual life. He wants to stick with you in your day-to-day. Yes, Stephen King might not be the scariest read of your life, but he's certainly one who is going to stick with you like almost no other authors. I still think about many scenes from The Stand every time people are talking with me about effective horror, because they just stand out. They stand as next level. And it's like, people dismiss King for many reasons, and I agree with a lot of the things people have problems with. His endings can be flubbed, though other times they're extraordinary. 11/22/63, in my opinion, The Dark Tower, but people will fight me on that. You'll also hear a lot of people say Stephen King is extraordinarily compelling. I agree with this, and I think it's tied into what we've talked about here. He puts the story around you, and so it's never going to pull you out of it. Even in his most extreme moments of horror, where the most fantastical elements come into play, I still feel like I'm in the story. He's the author who will tell you about your main protagonist's trouble pissing in the morning, and that is the point. Combined with the terror is why this genius has sold over 350 million copies of his books worldwide. It's a style everyone can connect with without having to sacrifice the horror. Just for the love of God, read Pet Sematary. I'm out. Peace.